Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Drja Kragt to our podcast. Drja is a leading expert in leadership development and organizational psychology, bringing a unique combination from both academic research and practical application. She's the founder of the Leading Lab, where she applies research to help organizations develop their leadership talent. Drja is also a relevant researcher in the leadership field, with her work published in top-tier scientific journals. In the University of Western Australia, Drja works as a lecturer in diverse areas such as leadership and work identity. Her unique approach combines top academic research with real-world application, making her insights remarkable for leaders and organizations in the field of leadership development. We are excited to dive into Drja's expertise and to learn more about effective leadership. Welcome to the show, Drja.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleased to be here.
It's a pleasure. Drja, to start, I would like to talk about your research. Your research touches the concept of leader identity. As a leadership scientist, can you explain to our audience the key insights for you about your research in this area and its implications for leadership development?
Absolutely. Great question to start with. Love talking about my research, of course. So I started my program of research about 12 years ago, and it started with this really simple observation that not a lot of people see themselves as leaders. So when you go around and you ask people, do you see yourself as a leader? They will oftentimes say, oh, I'm not sure, or no. And I was really curious about that. It's like, why is that the case, that the people who are in leadership positions or are about to take leadership positions don't see themselves as leaders? So I sort of started asking around why that might be the case. And I often heard things like, oh, I think a leader is someone who is in a top-level organizational position, or a leader is a very public official or a politician, right? I'm not, because I'm not in that higher-level positions, right? So I was really curious about that, and that's basically how my research started. So I was really trying to understand what is it that helps people to define themselves as leaders, and I ended up coming up with this idea, or not coming up with the idea, but borrowing the idea of identity, right? So identity is about how we see ourselves. Who do we think we are, right? And so within that larger field of identity, then there's this concept of leadership identity or leader identity, which is basically, how do you see yourself as a leader? Do you see yourself as a leader? Do you define yourself as a leader? And so it turns out that it's actually quite important to leadership. It informs your leadership behaviors, it informs effectiveness, it informs whether other people see you as a leader. All of that basically depends on whether you in the first place see yourself as a leader. So we went on to, together with my advisors, we went on to design a series of experiments and research studies, and all of them in a developmental context. So I was really interested to understand, okay, how can we then help people to find leader identity, to strengthen the sense of being a leader through developmental interventions, which is basically your training and development programs and workshops and all sorts of things like that. So in my dissertation, I did a bunch of studies and basically found support for this core idea that, well, two core ideas really. One, leader identity is really important to being a leader. And two, we can develop leader identity in training. So it's not just something you have or don't have. We can help you to develop that through training and development initiatives.
Pretty interesting, because when you're trying to develop any skill, I have found that some mature profiles, when they've been leading for a long period of times, probably they would think that it is hard to acquire a new skill.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting because, again, in my research, I actually have one study that targeted emerging leaders, so, novices. I have one study that targeted sort of middle managers, and one study that targeted executives and senior leaders. And actually, you're completely right. Like, what we did find that it is much easier to mold and sort of shape someone's leadership when they're fairly unexperienced or inexperienced. But we still can do that for senior leaders, even if they have been in the roles for a long time. The difference is it takes a lot more time and a lot more effort. And that's why a lot of the times developmental interventions for senior leaders are a lot more, dynamic. They have to involve more. They have to be a lot more challenging. And we actually show that is something that's driven by identity. I've actually a study that shows that, right? So for senior leaders who have this stronger sense of self, they know who they are, they know what their leadership is like, they've been in the roles for a long time. It takes a lot more effort to kind of help them to shape that or change that identity, but it still can be done. It's never really set, it's never really kind of, this is who you are and that's it, you're never going to change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what were your key findings?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. So like I said, we found that identity is really important. So it drives behaviors, it drives effectiveness, it drives results as leaders, it drives, competency acquisition. So learning leadership depends on having a sense of identity, right? If you don't see yourself as a leader and you come into a workshop or a program and you don't think you should be there, then surprise, surprise, or unsurprisingly, you're not going to actually take much away from that development because you just simply think, well, it doesn't apply to me. Like, why am I even here? So I think by and large, we really established the importance of leader identity to the whole development piece, but also to the whole leadership piece as well.
Pretty interesting. Darja, now I would like to know more about what is being a scientist. For many of us, science is often associated with medicine or astrophysics. Can you explain how science is connected to leadership studies?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's such a good question because when I heard it first time, I said, that is true. Like people think of science as something that's, very kind of established scientific fields. But I think what a lot of people don't realize about leadership or organizational psychology, that is, also science. And the way that we test ideas and hypotheses and research questions is actually based on the very same scientific principles we have in other fields, right? Maybe the methods are slightly different, or there's some things that we can't do because when you're studying rocks or stars, you have, you don't have limitations of dealing with human beings. But we do actually use very similar type of, positivist thinking when we go to testing those ideas. So to give you an example, there was a study, it's not my research study, but there was a study published a couple of weeks ago that I saw that's a fantastic example, which tested a leadership intervention. It was actually a very interesting one because typically when we think about leadership interventions or programs, we think about fairly long things. So like maybe long workshop, like a whole day workshop, a 2-day workshop, or like a program of works, which is like a couple of months long. This one was 20-minute intervention, so 20 minutes. So it was very simple. They made managers, and it was done in a real organization with like actual real, people. Mm-hmm. So they made managers in the treatment group. So they had a control group and a treatment group, which is your randomized control design, right? Which is the kind of the pinnacle of experimental designs. And they made managers in the treatment group watch a 20-minute learning module about how to best demonstrate supportive leadership. And so they gave them a bit of content, they gave them a bit of reflection question, and they made them write down intentions. So they said, okay, when you go into this next meeting, what are you going to do? Write it down. So actually write down 2 things that you're going to do to encourage people, to support people, to display that supportive leadership. And so that was 20 minutes before they went into that meeting. And the control group watched another learning module on something that was, not really on supportive leadership. And then they showed that the managers who were in a treatment group, they actually saw higher employee engagement and employee satisfaction in that meeting So there was an effect of the intervention. But even more importantly, they were able to then break it down into those components. So content versus reflection versus intentions, so setting intentions, and show which of those components had the most effect. And so unsurprisingly, it's the intention setting. So writing down those behavioral intentions that I am going to do this as a manager or I am going to do that as a manager. That was the strongest effect on driving that engagement, right? And so there you go. It's a randomized controlled trial, which is how science does things. So medicine would do a lot of randomized controlled trials. It relies on hypotheses, on some very strong theory. So in that way, leadership, a lot of leadership studies are actually scientific and provide very valid and reliable results, out of those really great rigorous methodological ways of doing things.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying.
You're welcome.
Darja, now I would like to talk about the myths. In your extensive work as a leadership scientist and practitioner, you've likely found many misconceptions about leadership. Can you share to us some of the main myths or biases or cliches about leadership that you have observed?
Oh, absolutely. Where do you start? There's so many. There's so many, but I do have three that I've kind of picked out that are probably not favorite, the ones that I dislike the most, right? So the first one is that not everyone can be a leader. So there's this persistent belief we have around leadership that it's reserved for the select few people, that there's something very special about people who are in leadership roles, right? And it's actually very widespread, which is really concerning. So last year we did a study that asked HR professionals a series of questions about leadership myths and to what extent those HR professionals support or reject those myths. And we found that a staggering 60% of HR professionals believe that not everyone can be a leader. 60%, right? So you have to think, the first thing I think about is that what are the implications of that for leadership development? Because a lot of the time in organizations, it's HR professionals who will design and deliver leadership development, right? Absolutely. So if they don't believe that everyone can be a leader, does that mean that they then don't give access to leadership development to all people? Because we know that happens. Absolutely. Yeah. So we, just by having that myth, I think we're excluding people from opportunities. And of course, what we know from development is that leadership is a skill or series of skills or competencies, right, that you can develop. But if we don't give people those opportunities, then they're not developing those skills. So they're not becoming leaders. So then it's like a cycle, right? So and then we think, oh, well, these people are not leaders, but they actually just never been given opportunities to step up and get those leadership roles or even just to receive some training. So I think this one is a really damaging one.
So real.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we know from research that there's pretty much nothing that's special about leaders. There's not a single characteristic or anything that distinguishes people as leaders versus non-leaders. Everyone can be a leader and everyone will have their unique style or special style of leadership. It's not going to be the same, but everyone certainly can be a leader. So that's my number one. That one I think is really important we start really talk about and think about more because it's very damaging, I think, detrimental to...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or you sometimes tend to be romantic, finding any special, like charismatic skills, any specific skill that you wouldn't see on a regular basis, average person, and you will dismiss them or you will lose the opportunity to develop a great leader within your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What's your second thought?
My second one, my second favorite, least favorite myth is that it's a title that makes you a leader. So remember when I said where my research started was an observation that people would not define themselves as leaders as long as they weren't in those high-profile, visible positions like politicians or CEOs. And so I think this is this idea of that it's a title. So by some magic, as soon as you were a CEO or as soon as you're a politician, you become a leader, right? And I think you're laughing because we know that's not the case. We have so many examples of people who are in those high profile positions, but they're really not very good at leadership. They're not very good leaders, right? Yeah. And we have so many examples of people who are not in formal positions of power, which is where I draw the distinction, like community organizations or volunteers or informal organizations or grassroots or even just, informal individuals. And they are well and truly leaders of their community, of the causes that they really believe in. So I think we have examples kind of on both ends to suggest that this is definitely not true. There's nothing that just comes out of the fact that you are in a position. Well, the thing that you have with a position is the power, legitimate power. I'm a manager or I am a supervisor, and that means that I have certain rights and, certain ways of influencing people. But leadership as such, as a social skill, as a way of inspiring people, as a way of motivating people, and all of those things, is not something that just kind of miraculously happens when you step up to those positions. Yeah.
This is pretty insightful.
Thank you. Yeah.
And what about the third one?
I think the third is this idea that leadership is about a leader. What I mean by that is a lot of our conversations in leadership are focused around these individuals in leadership positions, right? So, all three of them are probably interrelated to an extent, but this idea that it's all about the leader. It's all about, what skills they have, how do they behave, what do they do, what do they not do. Whereas in fact, leadership really is like a social process, right? So leadership is something that happens between people, like it happens between you and I, or it happens between me as a leader and a larger group of people, or even like a larger collective of people. And so when we only focus on that individual, on the leader, I think we lose a lot of important detail context, that it's a relationship. It's not just a person. Leadership is about a relationship. It's about other people. So it's important to think about not just about the leader as an individual, but more also what is the collective dynamic? How does that influence? How do other people influence leaders? Because, a lot of the times, you can be a leader, all you like, and then you go back and your team doesn't want to, do what you want to do, or is not on the same train with you. And, what happens then? So there's a lot of influence that, others can have on leaders. But we don't often acknowledge that. We always think about the leaders as the pinnacle of the leadership process. Yeah.
Do you connect this somehow with a shared leadership concept?
Yeah.
Yeah. In my experience, I have seen how the power of the group can make such a great impact on results. Just aside of what, or despite the kind of the leader they have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Darja, I would like to know more about your practical experience. Can you share an example of a particular successful leadership development initiative that you've applied in an organization and what it made it stand out?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So the first thing to know about leadership development is that it's always a series of activities. All right. So what I mean by that is that we have moved away from this idea that, you can put people into a workshop, for one day, and you will solve all of the issues. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So you're on the same page there. It's like, so we've really moved towards understanding that leadership development takes time. So it is a longer term process. And, we mean like years, but, for the development context, we're talking about months, okay? So for kind of initiatives, right? So it's not just about the time, it's also about this idea of intensity, right? So it's not enough to just put people through a single learning event and then somehow hope that, things are going to change, right? So the way that I apply this in practice and design programs is often that leadership program is a series of different activities that support ultimately kind of the ultimate outcome or the goal of developing competencies and achieving the results that the organization want to achieve. So very practical example, last year I ran a 10 months long leadership development program for a project-based organization, right? So I'm saying project-based here because it's very important because the project-based context is different from your regular kind of corporate context, right? So why? Because the project has a deadline. So they're working towards a deadline. Yeah, absolutely. So in a traditional corporation or government organization, you don't have a deadline. I mean, you have small deadlines, but you basically just kind of tick along with your job, like from one deadline to another. The project is like, when we reach the deadline, we're done. We're all gone. This organization does not exist anymore. Okay, so that puts an interesting kind of spin on the whole leadership dynamics, right? Because people know that this is only temporary, even if it's years, like they work together for 17 years, but it still has that temporary note to it, right? So what we did with this organization was to put a series of those developmental activities. Our core activity was a workshop. I mean, you still need those. And that is the place where people learn new content. They have an opportunity to discuss that new content. They engage in some interactive activities and things like that. We then had a group coaching to support that. So the group coaching was following the workshops. We get together in a couple of weeks' time or so, and we focus on discussing what we learned in the workshop, but we also focus on how the participants go about applying what they learned in the workshop. So, okay, after the workshop, what did you do differently? What did you learn? What did you succeed at? What didn't work? Why it didn't work? What are you going to try differently again? So that smaller group coaching conversation we find is very impactful. Also because all of these people are peers, so they all work with each other. So it's accountability because they're sitting in front of people they work with. And when they say, I am going to go and do this, the others are watching, right? They go, you said you're going to do this. What happened? So they will create accountability. So on top of that, we also had one-on-one coaching sessions to support then the individual journey. Okay. And we also had online learning materials. So that was purely the content. So they could go back and revisit something. They could read additional materials from the workshop. They could do an additional assessment. They could, watch additional videos. So they could remind themselves of what is the learning. We had a 360 assessment, so the competency assessment at the start of the program, at the end of the program, and something that no one else does or rarely does, we had 360 assessments in between during the program. Yeah. So not just before and after, but also at midpoints in the program. So people were receiving the feedback, the change feedback a lot quicker. They weren't just waiting till the end of the program to say, oh, what did others think? How do others think? So they were, it wasn't quite real life, but it was much quicker than just, at the end of the program. So we saw great impact from that. And then finally, there's a lot going on there, but finally we also have what I would call kind of behavioral nudges. So you're familiar? Yeah, so behavioral science tells us that in order to achieve behavioral change, so if we want to change any behaviors, right, what we basically need is a little small reminders along the way. Something that helps us to kind of, oh yeah, like, oh, I should do this, or oh, that's right. So we're very good at forgetting things.
My specialty.
Yeah, exactly. So what we need is remind people. So behavioral nudge in our case was very simple, very effective. We would send people like an email with a little reminder to say, oh, in the workshop we talked about communication styles. Have you tried to apply it? Here's another little, very small, nothing major, right? Here's another little thought. Here's another little research insight. Here's another little reflection question. Here's another little video that you could watch about that sort of topic. And so when people receive that email, the theory is that it's just that little bit of a reminder for them to say, oh yeah, that's right. I've committed to doing something about my communication. How about I go and do something about it now? So I actually found that there's another piece of research that informed this, and they actually found, surprisingly, that those kind of behavior, like real email reminders, were more effective than coaching sessions. Yeah. So the email, little emails with little reminders and kind of follow-ups were more effective. Why? Because coaching can be really overwhelming. You go through that hour of coaching, and you walk out of that session, and you're like, oh my God, like where do I even start, right? Like it's so much. Little email, one little thing for you to do as a leader. You're busy, right? You're a busy leader. Like we all know this. You go, here's one small thing I can do. It doesn't even almost feel like anything, but over time, that is what is changing your behavior, changing your approach. So very powerful. So that's all of the different things we did. Yeah.
So there's a high commitment during a whole process, right?
Yeah.
Not just a single piece of individual efforts.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Very insightful. I would like to learn more about that.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Darja, my final question is about the future. What emerging trends do you see in leadership or organizational development for the next 5 years?
Whew, I wish I knew. I wish I could, have a crystal ball to sort of. But look, top three, right?
Yeah.
Power of three. I think there's definitely a piece around collective and shared leadership, which is what we've touched on already. I think we're definitely, I hope we're going to see more real investment and thinking about enabling collective and shared leadership in our organizations. And I think that will predominantly be driven by this really unfortunate trend that we're seeing right now, is where our managers and leaders are burned out.
Yeah, that's
70-odd%, according to the latest Gallup data, are reporting high levels of burnout. So for me, it's like, how much more can we throw onto the leaders? How much more can we throw onto them and say, carry this and carry that? And, we're stacking all of that stuff on these individuals, and they just can't cope. They can't cope with that load, right? So to me, part of the solution, probably not all of it, but part of the solution to say, okay, does it have to be one person doing all of that? Could it be a co-shared or job share role? Could it be a role where there's two people in that position, but they have clearly separate sort of responsibilities? I think we're not quite there yet. I think we're starting to see a little bit of that happening, but it will be really interesting, I think, in the 5 years, because of the current just unsustainable situation for the leaders and managers. We will hopefully see more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel so connected with that idea because just right after the pandemic, the conditions are changing so fast each time, and the markets are really not the same as they used to be. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's really overwhelming.
Yeah.
Try to conduct a business as a leader, having all this, this weight just over your shoulders all the time, and it will be amazing to discover how can you distribute this amount of pressure or drive to better results, right? Within a whole team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a good segue to my second trend, which I think we will have to start to fundamentally rethink the whole idea of organizational design. So how our organizations are structured and organized. So, at its core, because the structures of that, the hierarchical structures is what's driving a lot of this pressure on managers, right? So there's this idea of this expectation that there's individuals in those hierarchical roles, and then everyone kind of falls under them, and it's like you work your way down the pyramid. How can we start thinking about organizing differently, right? So, and look, it's all out there already, right? We have self-managed teams. That research has been going on for 15, 20 years, easily, in terms of having a team that is self-managed, so it doesn't have a formally appointed leader or a manager, right?
But that information is somehow hidden.
Well, yeah. It's a problem with research generally. Yeah, I'll admit that. Yeah, it's hard to find. Yeah, absolutely. I just heard the other day that a colleague of mine in Europe is working on self-managed organizations. So not just the team, but what would it look like? And there are organizations in the world that are actually operating with self-managed organization model. I mean, there's only a few, but there's research that is going on to figure out what is it about those organizations that make it possible, and how do we successfully kind of take the practices and maybe try apply it somewhere else and change more organizations to become more self-organized and self-managed, right? So I think that's we will have to think about that in the next 5 years, hopefully. Again, I hope.
It's futuristic.
Well, I mean, maybe 10. Give it 10. Yeah.
And what's your last thought on these trends?
And look, my third, I think we are going to see more of evidence-based approach to a lot of leadership, organizational development. I'm really hoping, because you asked me, about leadership science and how, people don't think about leadership and organizational development as a science, but I really hope it's going to change. I think we're going to see more demand from organizations and leaders and society probably to say, what's the evidence for any of these things that you're doing? Where's the evidence? Where's the theory behind it? So kind of that more research approach. Where's the data? We talk a lot about data-driven decision-making in other parts of organizations. There's very little currently that's done in data-driven leadership development, data-driven organizational development, data-driven anything in this sort of space. And I think that should change. That we should definitely do it better. We have data. We know how to collect it. We know how to use it. We know how to inform it. And I think this is where I'm hoping that more organizations are going to embrace this approach of partnering with academic institutions or researchers or other experts to conduct essentially small research experiments internally, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So the study I told you about today was where the real organization brought in research team, said, can we test a 20-minute intervention on our actual managers, see the impact of that with data, and then obviously say, this is super effective, let's roll it out, let's use it more, right, in our organization. Something like that would be absolutely amazing to see more of, to say organizations actually partnering with researchers to test little small interventions, see if they're effective, and then kind of building up, what they do, but through this kind of more experimental approach. So
I see myself in the future working like that. Yeah.
Fantastic, excellent. So there's a couple of people, so welcome to the club.
Darja, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast today. Your insights on leadership development have been truly insightful. You've challenged some of our own perceptions about leadership, Thank you for breaking down concepts complex and making them accessible to our audience. Your passion for leadership is truly inspiring. For our listeners who want to learn more about Darja, work, or get in touch with her, you can find her at the Leading Lab website or connect with her on LinkedIn. We'll include these details on our show notes. Darja, thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Perfect. Yay.